Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1939, the UK and France declare war against the Third Reich on the 3rd of September. Australia and India declare war later in the day. South Africa on the 6th of September and Canada on the 10th of September. In 1940, Adolf Hitler set the date for Operation Sealion, the invasion of Britain, for the 21st of September. On the 7th of September, raids involving nearly 400 bombers and more than 600 fighters targeted docks in the East End of London. On the 15th of September, German attacks were decisively repulsed by the RAF in the climax of the Battle of Britain. 2 days later, Hitler called off Operation Sealion. In 1941, the RAF began daylight bombing of targets in northern France. In 1942, the Battle of Milne Bay ended in an Australian victory. It is often described as the first major battle of the war in the Pacific, in which Allied troops decisively defeated Japanese land forces. In 1943, the Italian Armistice was signed in Cassibile in Sicily on the 3rd of September. That day, the 8th Army crossed the Strait of Messina in Operation Baytown. Troop ships and support vessels left ports in Algeria, Libya, Tunisia and Sicily for Salerno for Operation Avalanche. In 1944, the Japanese cargo ship SS Shin'yo Maru was sunk in the Sulu Sea by a US submarine while carrying 750 American prisoners of war. 688 of them died. A total of 134 Japanese hell ships transported about 126,000 Allied prisoners of war in more than 156 voyages during the Second World War. And in 1945, the surrender of Japan became official with the signing of the Japanese Instrument of Surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September. This is celebrated annually in the US as VJ Day. I'm now joined by my co-host, Joe Quinn, an authority on the history of the Second World War.
How are things?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. So we went through events that took place in September in 1939, 40, 41, 42, 43, 45, 45. So this week, which is the first week of September, has got a lot of activity. And as you can see, the war started in the first week in September 1939. And as far as the Americans are concerned and the world is concerned, it ended in September 1945. So that's 6 years almost to the day. So let's start with the first one, which is the Britain and France declaring war on the Third Reich on the 3rd of September. Personal connection. My father was in London at the time. He was at church. He was an altar boy. And he remembers at 11 o'clock, with the sermon at the 11 o'clock mass, the priest came up and said, "We're at war." And then he came out and said it didn't make any difference at all. But the question I suppose that I want to ask, it's related to those points. First of all, that came up. First of all, did the Britain and France have an option? Could they have done something different?
No, they didn't have an option. They had exhausted all possibilities at that point. And it was very clear, really, by March 1939, that there were no more options on the table. The strategy had been, and it was a twofold reason, the strategy had been on the part of the Chamberlain government to engage with Hitler with regard to essentially what were known as border disputes in Europe, or territorial disputes, in order to solve the great sort of Nazi German dilemma of, sort of territory or living space. And this desire was very well known. And the French were preparing themselves for war, and they'd invested millions of francs into the, multi-million francs into the Maginot Line project. As we now know, that was a white elephant. And they had the largest army, or one of the largest armies in Europe at that particular point. And they'd developed their army quite successfully, but not so much their air force. They'd expanded their navy. But they weren't feeling fairly confident about the prospect of going to war again because of how white they had been bled by the First World War. The First World War badly traumatized their society in a way that I suppose we in Britain and Ireland would have understood very well. But France was very badly shaken by that conflict. And in the United Kingdom, there was very much a sense that war should be avoided unless it was absolutely necessary. So the political prerogative, the political necessity of negotiating with Hitler and trying to come to an accommodation with him was necessary, both on the domestic front, but also in terms of relations with the Commonwealth, particularly the Dominions.
Well, that's the interesting sequence, because in the First World War, the United Kingdom, or London, declared war on behalf of the whole British Empire. Yeah. So New Zealand, South Africa, the Australian Canadians are all vectored into it. It wasn't the same this time. And as we can see, there was a staggering, wasn't there? India, let's start with India, because the Viceroy made that decision, apparently, without any real consultation with any of the local stakeholders, including the Indian National Congress. So Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress are very much against the war. That's right. So that's got a lot of resonance and significance.
Yes, I mean, at that particular point, India was approaching some sort of, they were trying to achieve some sort of home rule type dominion status, but the Indian National Congress wouldn't really play ball. Mahatma Gandhi was not willing to come to a reasonable accommodation with the British government on this particular question. He wanted a full sovereignty, full autonomy. And he was not interested in basically being at the head, or having one of his acolytes being at the head of what would have effectively been a puppet type regime. He wanted full sovereignty and wanted the Indian National Congress to have full control of India's national destiny. So ultimately, it was necessary for India to stay within the empire for reasons that we now understand, because of the massive reserve of manpower that would be brought to bear in that war, as well as the industrial production and various different other attributes of India's war effort, which I think even to this day is not really fully appreciated.
Exactly. Some might argue that the Global South won the Second World War because of the natural resources and the human resources. Now, India at this point it was Sri Lanka, it was what we now call India, it was Pakistan, it was Bangladesh. And so that's the scale of the country that the Viceroy, an Englishman, a conservative politician, brought into war. But in the end, 2.5 million Indians then volunteered for the British Army. So a very powerful legacy. But we'll move on. We can discuss this in future programs. Australia, and they came in really quickly. And Robert Menzies was the Prime Minister, generally deemed to be the most enthusiastic imperialist of all the Dominion leaders. He was very much a big supporter of the British Empire. But Australia was really a reluctant partner in the Second World War to a certain extent, as we saw as the war went on.
Yes, well, the Australians took a nuanced view of, particularly with the approach of the conflict. Australia was very much divided at that time between two different kind of societies. You had the rural, largely rural Western Australia, which was more pro-empire, more pro-mother country, and had a sort of more pro-British outlook, whereas in the East, in the major urban centres like Sydney, Melbourne, all those East Coast, that belt of eastern urban areas, you had a more cosmopolitan mentality which had arisen, and there had
a lot of Irishmen there,
a lot of Irish as well, but that's not really, I wouldn't even factor that in as a really considerable point. I think what happened, and a lot of scholars have debated about this, I think what happened was, given the fact that 1 out of every 10 Australian men that actually perished in the First World War, a very high casualty rate among Australian manhood, and given the fact that you had disasters such as the Gallipoli campaign, which caused a massive political scandal in terms of Canberra's relationship with London. and resulted in a huge amount of controversy. And you had basically the father of Rupert Murdoch been stuck in the middle of that. It led to sort of a changing of attitudes in terms of Australia's attitude towards empire in the mother country. So that in 1938, the Australians indicated to the Chamberlain government that unless you really try and negotiate very hard with the Germans over the Sudeten crisis and at least give peace a chance, because everybody in Australia was following what was going on in Europe at that particular moment. They were all clued in, but there was an attitude within the Australian government that under no circumstances can we ask our people to go to war unless the imperial capital and the imperial government have done their utmost to basically try and secure peace and prevent war, and have exhausted all other options to the point that war is the option of last resort, in which case we will then come in. And that's exactly what happened.
And that was also true of New Zealand. Let's move on to South Africa, which declared war on the 6th of September. So not on the 3rd, for the very key ones, and not on the 8th, which is Canada, South Africa. South Africa was a very, very divided society at this point. And of course, the Afrikaans population were very much against joining the war.
True, but for national security reasons, the South Africans, and it was largely to do with internal security more than anything, that the South Africans decided to join the Imperial and Commonwealth war effort. But they stipulated that there would be national service, or a form of conscription, if you will, within the country itself, and people would be expected to serve. And it was the same at a particular point in Canada, but nobody would be compelled to serve against their will overseas. And the South Africans were very clear on that. And they would have the final say in terms of the amount of resources, in terms of the amount of manpower and so on and so forth that would be given over to serve the imperial cause. And the South Africans, it must be remembered that the South Africans played a very key part, particularly in the war in North Africa. And you had the better part of a South African division being captured at Tobruk. A lot of South Africans been taken prisoner during the final Battle of Tobruk before it fell to Rommel in 1942. And that was, the Australians had one of those moments, the New Zealanders had one of those moments, the Canadians, all the Commonwealth countries suffered a major defeat, where they had a whole load of their countrymen in the bag, as it were. Yeah. But the South Africans played an essential, pivotal part, both in terms of logistical support for the Allied war effort, particularly in Africa, as well as in the Battle of the Atlantic, and also played a leading role in along with Canada in terms of the Empire Air Training Scheme. Rhodesia and South Africa were key players in terms of that scheme, and South Africa was, if not the most willing partner, was certainly a willing enough collaborator with Britain in terms of Britain's strategic interests in that particular part of the world. And I would say that the South African input was by no means understated.
Good. And they, of course, the training, Ian Smith, who became the leader of the unilaterally declared independent government of Rhodesia, he was an RAF pilot, so he was a Rhodesian settler. True. And Tony Benn, best known as the left-wing Labour person in Britain, he did some basic training, I believe, in Rhodesia. So that echoes the point. Finally, Canada, briefly. I mean, Canada came in late, but probably in terms of its commitment, out of all the Commonwealth countries, to the armed forces as a provider of material and people. I mean, Canada's role in the Second World War was outstanding.
Without Canada, in both the First and Second World Wars, Britain could not have undertaken a significant role in either conflict. They wouldn't have been able to last. The Canadians really sustained the British war effort. They sustained it in terms of the supply, transatlantic convoys, essentially the supply of foodstuffs, manufacturing. The Canadian manufacturing was absolutely vital. The Canadians manufactured nearly, I believe, a tenth of all the Hurricanes that flew in the Battle of Britain, nearly just about that amount. It was the Cancar, the Canadian car foundry, down in the southern part of Canada. I think it was outside Toronto. Was the manufacturing plant responsible for basically under license from Hawker Aviation. They were manufacturing Hurricanes there, and Canadian Hurricanes actually played a key role when certain squadrons were equipped during the Battle of Britain at a particular point when they were running short of aircraft. They played a really vital role at that particular point. So, and then you have shipbuilding as well. You have the manufacture of other aircraft. You have the supply of manpower. You've got 1 million Canadian service personnel being deployed to Britain and eventually to Europe. And you've got 1.5 million service personnel in total that are recruited in Canada. And eventually Canadian conscription is introduced as well. And the Canadians have a very resolute attitude in terms of they actually even deploy a contingent. There's a Canadian contingent that's actually they begin their deployment to France around the time that France is collapsing around June 1940. They begin a deployment and then they withdraw them as part of the second BEF evacuation. So the Canadians had begun a formal deployment to Europe in 1940, but they didn't really see any action. Royal Canadian Navy as well played a key role in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. And the Canadians started out with about 15 ships in the Royal Canadian Navy at the beginning of the war, and they ended the war with over 400 ships, I believe. I think they were up there, and they were in the top 5 of the world's largest navies by the end of the Second World War. Yeah. And 1/3 of all the convoy escorts during the Battle of the Atlantic at one point, I think by late 1941-42, were Royal Canadian Navy escorts. So they played a vital role, and they were also involved in Operation Overlord as well. Massive role in Operation Neptune.
And massive role in Italy. So let's quickly deal with Ireland, if you can, in a couple of sentences, because Ireland's status is technically speaking, you can argue that Ireland's status was very similar to Canada's and Australia's. It was effectively it was a dominion country. They had accepted the king as the head of state. It wasn't an independent nation. So tell us a little bit, as briefly as you can, Joseph, I know it's a subject that you close to your heart, about the Irish role in this.
Yeah, well, you had partition, of course, in 1921-22, and you had Northern Ireland still being part of the United Kingdom, so it's involved in the war effort. You don't have conscription, but they're very much integrated within the British war effort. You do have recruitment on that part of the island, and you have the Home Guard, you have manufacturing for the war effort. Belfast plays a key role in terms of supplying, the construction of ships, aircraft, incredible amounts of kit basically provided for the British war effort. And I think
a very important training base.
Northern Ireland is a massive mustering ground for both British forces and American forces when they later come in. And the Canadians are also there briefly as well. But in terms of the South, in terms of what was formerly known as the Free State, became known as Independent Ireland after reforms to the Irish Constitution, and then later a republic after the Second World War. The Southern Irish state decides more or less, a few years after independence, that their de facto position in the event of another global conflict will be neutrality. That's a decision that's not made by the De Valera government. It's made by their predecessors under W.T. Cosgrave during the Free State era, and they're a very pro-British government, but they decide that neutrality will be the best course of action. However, that neutrality will be very much predicated on British favour, and the decision is that they will not allow a foreign belligerent to use Ireland as a base from which to attack Britain. So Britain's security interests are very much factored in with this neutrality. And we very much see this during the Second World War. But the Chamberlain government knew as early as the Munich crisis, they knew that the Irish weren't coming in. That had been indicated very clearly. And they also made the decision around 1938, around the time of the Munich crisis, they were leading up to talks to resolve an economic dispute that had been going on for 5 years between Southern Ireland and the UK. And they settled what was known as the annuities question. They settled it with a lump sum payment of £10 million, UK pounds back in the day. And also they decided to hand over the treaty ports. Very controversial decision. They included 2 ports in the south and also 1 port facility on the coast of Donegal. These ports were handed back basically by March 1939 to the Irish state. And the Irish state refused to give those ports back. Remains a very controversial aspect of Irish neutrality to this day, but what people fail to realise is these Southern Irish ports were largely obsolete by the time of the Second World War, and it was actually the combined chiefs that made the decision that the ports could be handed back and that they would no longer be of use because the ports in Northern Ireland were going to provide the key strategic role that the Royal Navy would need.
Look, Joe, we could talk for days about that topic.
Yeah.
A huge issue, and people very glibly say, oh, the war started in September and ourselves alone. This is an incredibly complex global event which involved millions, hundreds of millions of people all across the world. In one word, Joe, Operation Sealion, Hitler's operation, did it ever have a chance? In one word?
No.
Okay, we'll deal with that later, but that was, Hitler this week said, oh, we're going to go on the 21st of September. Didn't have a chance.
No.
The daylight raid started in France. I'm not going to, we'll come back to the role of air war. But this was what you had here is that the RAF was bombing technically an ally. France, With this point was technically it was an allied country. So there's lots of complications. So we're not going to go into this too much. I mean, unless you've got something to say briefly, Joe.
This is the RAF beginning the daylight bombing of targets in northern France in 1941. So northern France at that point was occupied, and this begins in early 1941. Jeff Wellham actually recalled the day he was brought in for a briefing. I think it was around January 41, maybe February. It was basically winter turning into spring. It had been a very bleak winter, sort of how the Battle of Britain had tailed off, and they were entering a new phase of operations. So the RAF Fighter Command were up to strength. They were able to successfully defend Britain's skies, and the Luftwaffe were mounting bombing attacks. They were upping pace in terms of the blitz on British cities. So the RAF decided to hit back, and they decided to wage an attritional type war. This is very much Trafford Lee Mallory's approach when he takes over Fighter Command to try and so it's essentially a series of operations. I'm trying to remember. You have circus operations. You've these are essentially light bombers, Boston bombers, what are also known as A-20 Havocs, and other forms of sort of twin engine light bombers. Maybe about 12 to 15 of them been escorted by massive waves. In some cases, an entire wing of RAF fighters. And the whole objective is really to, one, hit the port facilities in northern France, various different port facilities, including the obscure ones, and also try and bait the Luftwaffe, try and draw them out into a fight. Now, a lot of people would argue, a lot of experts would argue that this was a terribly wasteful, pointless campaign, which they waged well into 1942-43, where they were constantly just trying to bait the Luftwaffe into, dogfighting and essentially wear them down, while also depleting their own strength and losing their best talent. And they lost a lot of RAF fighter aces. Doug Bader went down, wing commander of Paddy Finucane, who was at one point the top RAF ace of the day, lost his life while attacking La Taquette in July 1942. You have lots of, RAF talent basically been lost in these campaigns. But it could be argued, and I would make the argument, that these type of attritional campaigns that the RAF were waging, the circus campaigns, were probably a key foundation in the overall Allied strategy to try and win over air supremacy over the Channel, and to build a path basically for the later combined RAF and United States Army Air Force campaign to essentially dominate the skies over northern France, which they eventually did by 1944. And as we know, that's what paved the way for D-Day. The Allies really controlled the skies at that particular point. And you could argue that Trafford Leigh-Mallory's campaign in those early days in 1941 was the stepping stones towards building towards Allied air supremacy over northern France.
Okay, that's great, Joe. Thank you very much. And let's talk about a quick one on the Milne Bay, which you know quite a lot about. So can you just distill your perspective on that?
Yes. So Milne Bay, this is actually one of my, I for a number of years, I actually had an obsession with Australia's campaign in New Guinea. And this is kind of very much Australia's kind of Battle of Britain moment, or Dunkirk moment, if you like. So the Japanese overran the Far East, a lot of parts of the Far East, and also countries like Borneo, Java, all these colonies that were essentially controlled by European powers, Singapore, Philippines, which was essentially an American enclave, a strategic enclave, effectively, you might say a client state of the United States, if you will, but had become independent, had its own democratic institutions, unlike other so-called colonies in the Far East, including French-controlled Indochina. All these countries fell very swiftly in these lightning Japanese advances, which occurred in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was accompanied by all these attacks going on in various different locations throughout the Indian Ocean and the Pacific area. So this is really where the theater of conflict is sandwiched between these two oceans. And the Japanese essentially overrun a lot of these territories in order mainly to secure the resources and also to knock out these garrisons. So Singapore is factored in as part of Australia's defence from 1941. What the Australians quickly realise is that actually Singapore is key to the defence of the Far East and has nothing to do with any defence of Australia in the event that the Japanese decide to adopt a war footing. So it's a complete red herring, and the Aussies are understandably a bit pissed when they realise they've been miffed, and then they lose a division in the surrender at Singapore. And the Japanese really overrun a lot of these territories. They use airborne landings, seaborne landings, of course, and whatnot. But in terms of the taking of Singapore, I mean, really, the Japanese army did that on the saddles of bicycles. You had hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers under General Yamashita essentially riding down on bikes from Indochina, which they were able to get a plentiful supply of bikes because everybody was on bikes in those days in that part of the world. It was a very popular mode of transport, and the Japanese army commandeered all these bicycles or had them shipped over from Japan and various different other places, and they essentially invaded Malaya on bicycles. Just basically Type 97 Arisaka rifles and a bicycle is essentially how.
So I mean, the question we were discussing, because we are running a little bit out of time.
Okay.
Discussing.
So
is why did the Allies do so badly against Japanese land forces up to this point?
Well, why they did so badly against Japanese land forces is because logistically they were totally unprepared for the scale of the Japanese assault. They were unprepared for the type of warfare that the Japanese were waging, and they were essentially outflanked in every place. They were in Malaya, and Singapore was just essentially, it was a trap, really. And the British had bulked up their defenses around Singapore and in Malaya for quite some time, but they were totally unprepared for the type of war that the Japanese were prepared to wage in order to conquer territory. And this ultimately leads us to the campaign in New Guinea and the Battle of Milne Bay. And what really happens, in short, in the Battle of Milne Bay is the first Allied victory, land victory against Japanese forces takes place when the Japanese land in a southern cape of New Guinea in an attempt to try and have a flanking advance towards Port Moresby, which is the major Allied centre in southern New Guinea. And the next stop is really Australia. And the Aussies have this idea that if New Guinea falls, basically the Japanese will then attack Australia, possibly invade Australia, and that they'd have no way of defending the continent. So it's really a Dunkirk, Battle of Britain moment. They defend Port Moresby from the air, and then this attack happens. A naval amphibious force lands at Milne Bay, and they make their way inland. There are mountains directly in front of them, and their only way to advance is westward. And what's facing them are two Allied-controlled runways. Runway B is basically where the Allies hold them, and the runway runs from the sea right to the foothills of the mountains, and that it's across that runway that the Japanese have to attack. And the Japanese, over the course of 3 days, are faced down by a line of infantry on one side of the runway. And this infantry is made up of Australian soldiers, it's made up of New Zealand soldiers, and it's actually made up of Black American GIs, who were among the first combatants in the Pacific War. It's absolutely incredible. It's a very little known story. And they essentially man dugout positions all along the stretch of this runway, and they mow down wave after wave of banzai charges. Meanwhile, number 75 and number 76 Royal Australian Air Force squadrons take off from the runway just a couple of miles to the west, and they take off every 30 minutes during daylight hours and basically come in and do strafing runs on Japanese positions or as they're trying to attack that runway. And both those Australian squadrons, never mind the amount of ammunition that they went through, they actually burnt out 300 machine gun barrels in the course of doing these strafing runs. And over 3 days, they basically wiped out the bulk of that Japanese force, drove them back to the sea, and then the Japanese had to evacuate Milne Bay. First major Allied victory over Japanese forces in the whole of the Pacific campaign.
Amazing story, really very little known. I know it's better known in Australia. I mean, very quickly now, we're going on to 1943, September 43. So the 3rd of September, that is tomorrow, second today. That's when the Cassibile Armistice was signed. I mean, it's something that's close to my heart because my father was in Sicily on that day, preparing to be shipped off to join their fighting in the mainland. And the issue, and I don't think we can deal with it here because it's such a complicated story. The issues are, why did it take the Allies so long to respond to the Italian government when they started reaching out? The Italian government, as soon as Mussolini was deposed, the Italian government was making feelers, we want to get out of the war. The Allies didn't really respond to it. And when they did, it was done in this almost peculiar, I mean, it was people going by train to Madrid and then flying all over them. And it was really extraordinarily complex. And in the end, Castellano, who's in the photograph that we showed earlier, the Italian general, he was given the power to sign the deal. He signed it, and then afterwards he was given the full terms of what he was told he had agreed to, which included unconditional surrender. So it's an extraordinarily complex story. I'm not going to go into it here, and so I'm going to move on quickly to the hell ships. Let's not talk about that too much now. But the question I think that across everybody's minds today is why did a country as civilized and as pleasing and as delightful to visit, and so many Japanese friends that I have, what happened? Why did the Japanese behave so badly towards Allied prisoners and prisoners of war in the Second World War in this period? I mean, in a word again, Joe, can you just tell us why? The hell ship story is part of that. The prisoners of war who've been already weakened by years and years of abuse were put in ships, sold off to the homelands mainly, but not just there, Taiwan and elsewhere, to work in factories and mines, which killed them off, not quite so quickly, actually. But they were treated extremely badly. So question is, what happened in Japan that made them so brutal towards prisoners of war?
There was a growth of aggression in the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars. The Japanese had actually been an Allied power like Italy, and they felt a little bit aggrieved. They felt that they hadn't had a fair... they'd actually been granted territory in China under the terms of the 1919 treaties, the Allied treaties that had taken place, that had been signed in Paris. But the truth about it is that the Japanese felt ill done to, and there was a growth of militarism in the 1920s and 30s. There was an attitude that the Japanese had an entitlement to assert themselves within the Asian sphere. And there was also I think the Japanese felt as though their European counterparts, and they felt they had an equal footing with a lot of their European counterparts, that they weren't quite being treated as equals. And the brutality that actually takes place, I think it's a combination. I believe it's a combination of both the sense that they felt that they were under attack, and it was a sort of a killer be killed mentality that was very much programmed into them. Japanese propaganda was pretty vicious in those days. But most of all, most centrally, is the code of war, the code of honor that is observed by the Japanese people, the Bushido Code. When they came across these prisoners of war that had surrendered in their tens of thousands right across the Far East, American POWs, Australians, British, Commonwealth soldiers, Indians, and so on and so forth, they looked upon these prisoners as people who had surrendered their honor and surrendered their dignity, and ought to have taken their own lives in a very Japanese custom because of the shame of surrender. The Japanese could not comprehend the scale of the surrenders that they had managed to preside over, and they began to view these prisoners and their commanders with utter contempt and treated them accordingly. And it was simply part of the Japanese worldview to treat conquered peoples and also conquered prisoners according to these lights. And that goes some way. I think a combination of this aggressive, militaristic wartime propaganda, as well as this samurai code, which was enshrined, this honor code was enshrined, a kind of a cult, if you will, within Japanese culture at that time.
Okay, we're coming to the end of the show. The last one, of course, is the 1945. So, as I said, that in America, VJ Day is celebrated today, 2nd of September. Whereas in the United Kingdom, I'm not sure, we're probably in Australia or elsewhere, 15th of August is the celebration day. So what explains the gap?
Well, I think there's probably a gap between these anniversaries because of the fact that I think the 15th VJ Day, 15th of August, is got more resonance with a UK and Commonwealth audience. Probably something to do with the fact that a lot of the British and Commonwealth camps were formally liberated on this particular date. And when I say formally liberated, the Japanese essentially lowered the flag, and in some camps, particularly in Japan, prisoners watched as the prison commanders and camp guards fell to their knees and bowed in front of a radio as they listened to the voice of their emperor for the very first time. And the scale of the shock of the announcement that the war was coming to an end, and essentially the Japanese, particularly led by their emperor, were bowing to the Allied terms, sent shockwaves throughout the Japanese control. And the Japanese still controlled much of Asia at that particular time. They hadn't been substantially defeated on land. And to have capitulated in this manner probably was something that, you know, the psyche of these Japanese soldiers, these occupiers, probably wasn't prepared for. And what they simply decided to do is they decided to essentially put aside their arms or lay down their arms and open up the camps to the POWs and do an about face in many regards. So VJ Day for many POWs and for many people within, I suppose, the British world was very much the 15th of August. Because the 2nd of September, from an American point of view, is a more formal event, because this is this moment where you have the bulk of this Allied fleet, 500 ships coming into Yokohama Harbor. You have thousands of aircraft flying overhead. You have General MacArthur and the USS Missouri, flanked by Nimitz, and all these various different Pacific commanders. And this is their moment of glory, the moment of victory, and the formal signing of the Japanese surrender. And from an American point of view, given the fact that this was an American-led and controlled event, celebrating victory on this day makes more sense, because you have a time, you have a location, and you've got all these American faces, these American figures that are essentially at the head of the Allied top table, if you will, and they're very much taking center stage. So from an American point of view, within the American mindset, the 2nd of September makes far more sense than the 15th of August. I think the symbolic nature of the Japanese surrender has more of an impact upon the British worldview and the British-led worldview than it does with the Americans, who are more into, I think they like surrender ceremonies. I think they like placing them at a particular it's the whole Appomattox courthouse kind of syndrome, I think, with
Well,
the
it's a
Americans.
dramatic picture, isn't it? And of course, it was in a way, this is the start of the Western European imperialists are leaving, and
Yes.
America becomes the dominant power in Pacific. So there's a lot more to be talking about that. So that's a brilliant review of these dates. So don't go, Joe. I'm just going to play the next, which is about what's happening in the Second World War community across the world. On the 12th to the 14th of September, the We Have Ways Fest will be held at Blackpit Farm near the Silverstone racetrack. The Chelsea History Festival is taking place at the Royal Hospital and the National Army Museum in London on the 24th to the 28th of September. On the 31st of October, the Second World War Research Group Scotland is organising a conference about Scotland in the Second World War at UHI in Perth in Scotland. On the 6th to the 7th of November, the Remembrances of the Second World War Conference is taking place in Paris, and the 18th International World War II Conference is taking place in New Orleans in the US on the 20th to the 22nd of November. Anyway, look, I'll bring Joe back. Yeah, hello, Joe. The thing is, not many people realise this, and the International Second World War History Network Second World War History Network has been set up basically to coordinate all the activities. And I was going through the list of things that are happening in Britain on the Second World War in the autumn, and there's dozens. The Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, there's something happening all over the world, and you can see from these events. And I'm listing the prominent ones. I know that you love the We Have Ways Fest event, which is taking place in 2 weeks. Just tell people about that people who don't know.
Well, this takes place at the Blackpit Brewery farm in Northamptonshire, and for anybody who's ever been there, it's tremendous fun. I was at the very first one. I was actually a guest speaker at the very first We Have Ways Festival, and it was just after COVID, and first festival that I had attended in a long time, and to have this big crowd of nearly 1,000 people. Tanks, military equipment, and an anti-aircraft gun firing into the sky every night to signal, shall we say, the end of, shall we say, everybody standing down for the day and, enjoying a beer. The atmosphere was absolutely amazing. So you've got talks taking place right throughout the weekend at various different locations within the festival site. You have, speakers mingling with ordinary attendees, and the We Have Ways movement has been going for well over, it's been 6 years now in the running, because the We Have Ways podcast has been running since April 2019 and has attracted quite a lot of listeners and quite a lot of viewers to a lot of the events. So it's a big movement. Last year I was at the We Have Ways Fest, and I believe it was somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 attendees at that. So it's grown exponentially in size. I'm sorry to say that I won't be at this year's We Have Ways Festival. Unfortunately, I've got too many clashes going on, so unfortunately I'm going to have to give it a miss. But I hope to be at it next year. But for all those who are going to attend this year, have one on me and enjoy the festivities and enjoy the fun. It's for a World War II enthusiast. This is John Hammond's introduction to Jurassic Park, basically.
Yes, and a shout out to James Holland, Al Murray, and all the team that made it happen. It's amazing, amazing project. So I hope to be there. Anyway, that's it for the moment, Joe. So I'm going to say goodbye. Don't go away, but we'll say bye-bye from the show. We'll be coming back. Fantastic review of these moments in history. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Anybody wants to talk to Joe, contact him directly. He's got incredible talents, a great teacher, and a great source of information. So, Joe, thanks very much. What I'm going to do now, I'm just going to just tell people about the International Second World War History Network. So, the International Second World War History Network is a non-profit initiative that aims to connect the Second World War history community on a cross-border basis. We reach out to museums, associations, universities, content creators, enthusiasts, and relevant central government and local government institutions. The network publishes a monthly bulletin and runs a regular YouTube show. Its annual conference is to be held in London on the 9th of May 2026, and we plan to launch a website. For further information, contact Edmund O'Sullivan at edmundosullivan1@gmail.com. Anyway, that's it for this edition, the first edition of This Week in the Second World War. I hope you found it interesting. I found it fantastic to listen to Joe. And I know we got some people watching live. We'll be sending out the link for people to watch it on YouTube. This is an open initiative. It's a firmly non-profit. It's not even commercial. We're not asking for any money at all. What we're doing, we're reaching out to the community, and there's an incredible amount of talent in the universities and the regimental associations, as you would expect, and in the museums. But there's a huge number of people who are like me, who are not academics, not historians. And they are people who are doing the work to find out and tell the story, usually about their own families, how their family members were involved in the Second World War. And this is unearthing a huge amount of information that gives a different perspective on what this conflict was. In my view, the May 1945 was the greatest moment in British history, and it's something we should never forget. And the responsibility falls on my shoulder, the son of the veterans, to make sure that the memory of this period of our history is not forgotten. So we need to be ensuring that the story is told appropriately in a way that is resonant for the younger people. Anyway, that's my mission. Thanks for joining us on this episode. We'll be back soon with another one. So until then, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.